Hello everybody and welcome to PowerEight, where we're all about high power commander. I'm looking at how to build hard hitting, resilient and synergistic decks in the EDH format. Today we're going to be looking at Omnath, Locus of Rage, so let's have a look at our commander. Omnath, Locus of Rage is 3 red, green for a 5/5 elemental creature. He has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, create a 5/5 red and green elemental creature token. He also has a second ability. Whenever Omnath, Locus of Rage or another elemental you control dies, Omnath deals 3 damage to any target. So some initial observations about Omnath. That ability to get a 5/5 elemental whenever a land comes into play is really powerful. 5/5 is a big body. His second ability of being able to do 3 damage when an elemental we control dies is also quite abusable. We were able to snipe off problematic creatures or deal damage directly to opponents' faces if attacking is not an option. 7 CMC though is quite a heavy cost, and I think that is kind of placing a bit of a ceiling on Omnath. We can't get him in that quickly, but we are going to have to try and ramp out and get him in as quickly as we can. So some of the categories we're going to look at and how I would build an Omnath deck. We're going to look at some ramp. This is about getting lands from our library onto the battlefield as quickly as we can. We're going to have a look at some other landfall matters creatures, so a bit of redundancy for Omnath himself if he's not in play. Interaction, how are we going to stop our opponents' game plans. Sacrifice outlets, so this is around Omnath's second ability, being able to sacrifice elementals at will. Card draw, every EDH deck needs card draw, so we're going to have a look at a few options that we can use for Omnath. Protection, as I mentioned before, a casting cost of 7 CMC is quite a lot. There are going to be quicker decks out there that are going to be getting set up and see Omnath coming, so we need to try and protect him as best we can. We're going to have a look at some finishers as well, so these are cards which are designed to take your opponents by surprise. How are you going to win the game from a position where they thought they were safe? We're going to have a look at some lands as well. Obviously these are a really important part of the deck because a lot of our ramp package goes and finds these lands, and we're also going to have a look at traps. So these are a couple of cards or particular strategies which I think if you want to be building a really high power Omnath build, you perhaps don't want to be using these cards. So we're going to look at our ramp package. We actually play 20 ramp cards in total in this deck, so it is a high percentage of our deck. We've got Search for Tomorrow and Font of Fertility, which can both be played for 1 green mana, and you can get a landfall later on in the game. We also play Rampant Growth, Sakura Tribe Elder, Farseek, Nature's Law and 3 Visits. These all cost 1 and a green and allow you to get a land into play immediately. For 3 mana, we play Nissa's Pilgrimage, Cultivate, Kadama's Reach, Roiling Regrowth, Harrow and Entis Restoration. So I think it's really important as part of the Omnath deck that you are playing low to the ground ramp. I think over time there have been more cheaper options printed. Entis Restoration is a new one that has supplanted something that I was probably playing previously. The 4 mana ramp slots have migrated to the lower end, so the 2s and the 3s. It's really important in higher power metas that you're doing things early, so I think the quicker you can get your lands out, and if you can possibly do multiple land ramps on one turn, I think that's better than kind of putting 5 CMC ramp in your deck, because I think by the time you get there you're going to be overtaken by quicker decks. Omnath CMC again is going to be a problem. We also play Ranger's Path and Migration Path, so these are the last 2 remaining 4 mana ramp spells. Ranger's Path allows you to get 2 forests, and Migration Path has a cycling ability. So the cycling ability is why this is still playable, I believe. Being able to discard this card and draw a card if you don't need the landfall at that particular time, I think is really strong. So these are the cards which generally allow us to find lands from our library and get them onto the battlefield. We also play a smaller ramp package that doesn't necessarily do that in the same way. We play Sol Ring because it's just the best thing at getting Omnath out as quickly as possible. Lotus Cobra for 1 and a green, and you get a 2/1 snake. It also has a landfall ability of whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you add 1 mana of any colour. This card can be pretty broken if you get it out early. With all the extra land drops we're going to have, you can net 2-3 extra mana from Lotus Cobra, and that can really allow you to accelerate forward. Kalani Heart Expedition is an enchantment that costs 1 and a green. This also has a landfall ability. Whenever a land enters, you put a quest counter on it, and then once it has 3 quest counters, you can sacrifice it whenever you like to go and find 2 basic land cards. We also play Goblin Anarchomancer, which is a red and a green for a 2/2 Goblin Shaman. Each spell you cast that's red or green costs 1 less to cast. This is also really powerful, similar to Lotus Cobra in the mid game. Once we're playing multiple ramp spells a turn, this can really reduce the costs of those spells. Mina and Den Wildborn costs 2 red-green for a 4/4 elf ally. This has an ability that allows us to play an additional land on each of our turns, but really it's there for its second ability, which allows you to play red and a green and return a land you control to its owner's hand. Target creature gains trample until end of turn. The trample is nice, that's a little bit of extra gravy if you want to get some damage over. So with what we've got on board, we're able to get 2 land drops without having to use any cards. If you're not willing to commit more to the board, if you know somebody's got a board wipe, or you know there's some interaction, being able to just use what you've already got, Omnath Locus of Rage out for example, with Mina and Den and a few lands, you can really start getting those land drops without having to use any extra cards. So we've had a look at our ramp. Let's have a look at some of the cards we're going to use to benefit. So our Landfall Matters cards, we have Scoot Swarm, costs 2 and a green for a 1/1 insect. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters a battlefield under your control, create a 1/1 green insect creature token. If you control 6 or more lands, create a token that's a copy of Scoot Swarm instead. And this can get out of hand really quickly. The great thing about this is you can get it out early too, so you've got a bit of protection. You can use your insects early game to just chump block a few attackers, keep Scoot Swarm alive, and then once you've got to 6, it really starts to escalate. For 6 mana, we play Phylath World Sculptor. This is 4 red-green for a 5/5 elemental. This creates green plants for each basic land card you control when it enters the battlefield, and then its landfall ability allows you to put 4+1 counters on each plant you control. Rampaging Balos costs 4 green-green for a 6/6 with trample, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may create a 4/4 beast. Titania Nature's Force costs 4 green-green for a 6/6. This is also an elemental. You may play forest cards from your graveyard. That is a nice ability, but it's not necessarily the way that this deck is set to function. It's really there for that second ability of whenever a forest enters the battlefield under your control, you get to create a 5/3 green elemental creature token. So there's a lot of elemental synergy in this as well. We want to be laying elementals and creating more elementals so that we can really lean into that second ability of Omnath's, which is doing 3 damage to any target when they die. If we have enough elementals out, that can really deter people from wiping the board or messing with us too much. We also play Avenger of Zendikar, which is 5 green-green for a 5/5 elemental. When Avenger of Zendikar enters the battlefield, we can create a 0/1 green plant creature token for each land we control. And then his landfall ability is whenever a land enters the battlefield under our control, we may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant. The main aim of this deck is to lay these threats and force our opponents to deal with them. And then once that's dealt with and they think they've cleared the way, we lay another threat and we start laying more lands on top of that. You don't really want to commit many of these to the board if you can help it. You really want to kind of lay one threat, get to a position where your opponents have to deal with it, and then you're ready with a backup. So our final Landfalls Matters card is actually one that I'm going to be highlighting with a yellow border to indicate that it's not listed online as one of the cards that you should be running in an Omnath deck. It is Nesting Dragon, which is 3 red-red for a 5/4 flying dragon. This card is bonkers. If there's any card that I want to see in my starting hand, it is Nesting Dragon. I don't know why it's not being played more, but when you're laying lands, Nesting Dragon gives you so much value. A 5/4 flyer for 5 mana is already a beater. Its landfall ability allows you to create a 0/2 red dragon egg creature token with Defender whenever a land comes into play under your control. But this also gets, when this creature dies, create a 2/2 red dragon creature token with flying and fire breathing, which is pay red. This creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So Nesting Dragon is brilliant because its converted mana cost of 5 allows you to get it out early. You can lay lands, create those dragon eggs which give you protection from other people's boards. And it also gives you brilliant board wipe protection. So if you have a little army of dragon eggs and somebody wipes the board, you then create however many 2/2 red dragon creature tokens with flying and fire breathing that can start putting pressure on opponents' life totals immediately. So it gives you a backup on top of that. So yeah, Nesting Dragon. If you haven't got one of these and you play an Omnath deck, get a Nesting Dragon. You won't regret it. Now we're going to look at some of the interaction we're going to play. So these are spells that get us out of sticky situations or allow us to interrupt opponents' game plans. I play Nature's Claim for 1 green, Destructive Revelry for red and a green. Both of these cards allow us to destroy a artifact or enchantment, and what we're going for here is versatility. The interaction package in this deck is not extensive, it's not really a control deck. We are only here to target key pieces that really disrupt our game plan or really hamper us. And we also play Beast Within for 2 and a green and Chaos Walk for 2 and a red, and these spells allow us to get rid of any problematic permanent. We also play Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast. So for 1 red, these spells allow you to counter a spell if it's blue, or destroy a target permanent if it's blue. So I've put these in the interaction package because they are removal. Another reason these are in the deck is to protect Omnath when he's coming into play. A lot of quicker blue decks will have a counter spell lined up for Omnath, so being able to cast one of these to allow him to enter and start getting your value is really important. We also play 3 board wipes in Blasphemous Act, Magma Quake and Starstorm. So Blasphemous Act most of the time is cast for 1 red mana and doing 13 damage. It is a sorcery, so that does hamper it a little bit, but given it's so cheap to do that much damage, it's definitely an include. Magma Quake and Starstorm cost X red, and they are both instants which allow us to cast these before our turn and allow us to rebuild our board first. The interaction package is quite light. We are not there to control the table. I would advise you let the blue players worry about that. You care about yourself. I've found with Omnath, he is a magnet for enchantment auras, which remove his abilities. Things like Imprison on the Moon, which would turn him into a colourless land with no abilities. That could be game breaking. So be careful and selective about where you use your interaction. So now we're going to look at some of our sacrifice outlets. These cards are there to really make use of Omnath's second ability, which is getting that 3 damage whenever an elemental we control dies. For 2 mana we play Goblin Bombardment for 1 and the red. This is sacrifice a creature and Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to any target. So this is an extra little bit of damage on top of the 3 we get from Omnath. It doesn't have to go at the same target. Altar of Dementia is another free sacrifice outlet. It's an artifact, and you can sacrifice a creature. Target player puts a number of cards equal to the sacrifice creature's power from the top of their library into their graveyard. So it's not really a strategy of the deck, and I would certainly advise that you really can't go for a mill for more than 1 player, but it is a nice secondary backup option if we are finding 1 player at the table is particularly difficult to deal with through direct damage, for example if they're gaining life. When we're creating 5/5s, it's not unheard of, certainly in the later game, that can be achieved. What I would suggest though is you pick a player and try to mill them. Don't spread it around because you're not going to be able to do enough with this card. For 3 mana we play Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar. So Ashnod's Altar is sacrifice a creature and add 2 colourless mana. Phyrexian Altar is sacrifice a creature and add 1 mana of any colour. For 4 mana we run Greater Good, cost 2 green. You can sacrifice a creature, draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, then discard 3 cards. So this is here as a bit of card draw as well as a sacrifice outlet, provided the creature that we're sacrificing has power 4 or greater. This is actually netting us cards, and it's not only netting us cards, it's also allowing us to select cards from the top 4 or 5 cards in our library, so that can get out of hand really quickly. The last sacrifice outlet that we play is Perilous Forays. This is 3 green for an enchantment. This is the only one that actually costs mana, but I do believe it is worth it, because when you pay 1 and sacrifice a creature, you can search your library for a land card with a basic land type and put it into play tapped, and then shuffle your library. If we have Omnath out, Perilous Forays and an elemental, we can sacrifice that elemental for 1 mana, get ourselves the 3 damage to any target, find a basic land for within our deck, and that replaces the elemental we've just sacrificed. So we can do that for as many times as we have mana open, and also a little caveat of as many times as we have basic lands left in our library. Just be aware when you're using this card that you can run out of basic lands without killing the table. When you're searching through your deck with your first trigger, just have a little count of how many you've got, and then make sure that you're picking your targets appropriately based on how many basic lands you have. But Perilous Forays, the brilliant thing about this as well is if you can't kill everybody at your table in 1 turn because you don't have enough mana, for every time you're doing it, you're actually ramping yourself for next turn. So that can kill players quite quickly if that's not dealt with. We're now going to have a look at some card draw that I'd recommend for Omnath. For 3 mana, we have Outcast Trailblazer, Garruk's Uprising and Elemental Bond. These all trigger when creatures with sufficiently high power come onto the battlefield. I really think this is the way we want to be going with Omnath. Outcast Trailblazer is a little bit of a ramp spell in that we can plot it earlier on in the game, cast it for free, and add 1 mana to our mana pool when it enters. Garruk's Uprising gives our creatures trample, which can also be quite handy, and it also replaces itself as it draws us a card when it comes in if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. Elemental Bonds doesn't have any upsides other than it just requires creatures with lower power to trigger, so their power only needs to be 3 for us to draw a card. I also play Sylvan Library for 1 in the green. This is an enchantment. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 of those cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put that card on top of your library. So this is a pretty powerful and staple green ramp card. I think if you can afford it, every green deck should really be running Sylvan Library. Snake Umbra is probably not such a well-known card. Snake Umbra is an enchantment aura for 2 and a green. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has, whenever this creature deals damage to an opponent, you can draw a card. So ideally we want to get this onto Omnath, and then whenever we sacrifice an elemental, we get to draw a card. It also has an added bonus of having Totem Armor, so that gives Omnath a bit of protection from a board wipe or something, or a destruction spell. So I also play Nissa Vital Force, which is the only planeswalker in the deck. She costs 3 green for a Nissa with 5 loyalty. Her +1 ability states untap target land you control. Until your next turn it becomes a 5/5 elemental creature token with haste. It's still a land. So this is a really good +1 ability because it allows you to protect her the turn she comes in, so you can turn one of your lands into a 5/5 blocker. Her -3 ability says return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So this is also a really useful ability because it allows us to get threats back from our graveyard that may have been removed earlier in the game and relay those and keep the pressure on our opponents. And her -6 ability is what she's really here for. For -6 you get an emblem with whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control you may draw a card. So it's only -6, she comes in with 5 loyalty. So the last 2 cards in the card draw section are actually tutors. Worldly Tutor, it's a green staple. We can search our library for a creature card and put it on top of our library for 1 green mana. And I also recommend Nissa Resurgent Animist. For 2 and a green we get a 3/3 Elf Scout. She has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, add 1 mana of any colour. So she is a Lotus Cobra in effect. But then if this is the second time that ability has resolved this turn, we can reveal cards from the top of our library until we reveal an elf or an elemental card. Once we've revealed an elemental or elf, we can put it into our hand and put the rest on the bottom of our library. So now we're going to have a look at some protection spells. Omnath is likely to have a target on his back when he comes in. As I mentioned earlier, there are quicker decks around which are going to be set up and trying to interact with him on his way into the battlefield or kill him once he's entered. So we've got to do what we can to make sure that he sticks. We play 3 artifacts: Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots and Champion's Helm. These can all be equipped and give hexproof or shroud. We also play Veil of Summer, which costs 1 green for an instant. Draw a card if an opponent has cast a blue or black spell this turn. Spells you control can't be countered this turn, and you and permanents you control gain hexproof from blue and from black until end of turn. So this card is really in here to protect Omnath from a counterspell on his way in. Deflecting Swat here for the same reason of protecting him from a removal spell. And Heroic Intervention is just premium protection for your board. So for 1 in the green, you can give all permanents you control hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So now we're going to look at the business end of the deck, which is the finishers. So these are cards that we really want to take our opponents by surprise with, and we want to win when our opponents think they're safe. Tempt with Vengeance is a sorcery for X and red. It has a tempting offer. Create X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens with haste. Each opponent may create X 1/1 red elemental creature tokens with haste, and for each opponent who does, we create that many more. It's unlikely in this deck that your opponents are going to take the offer, but with a sacrifice outlet, late game we might have 12 mana lying around. If we can pump 12 mana into this, that's 12 lightning bolts with a sacrifice outlet, and that can really start to finish players off. Scapeshift is a sorcery for 2 green. We can sacrifice any number of lands, search our library for up to that many land cards and put them onto battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this is an absolute powerhouse in the Omnath deck. Again, late game, however many lands we've got, we can sacrifice all of them and find that many tapped lands. Interesting points around Scapeshift. The sacrificing of the lands is not a cost of the casting of the card. It only resolves once the card resolves, so we can't be blown out by a counterspell in that way. And another thing to note is that we can search our library for that many land cards. There is no restriction on the lands we can find. So we can find any utility lands, any fetch lands that we want to find. The next finisher is Insurrection. So I've given this a gold border as well because this is not listed online as a card that you should be playing in Omnath, but I disagree. I think this card has fallen out of favour because it does cost 8 mana, costs 5 red for a sorcery. Untap all creatures and gain control of them until end of turn. They gain haste. This card can win you games out of nowhere. The brilliant thing about Insurrection as well is if you have one of those sacrifice outlets out, you can sacrifice all your opponent's creatures before the end of turn, so they don't get anything back. Effectively, it's a board wipe. It's a free swing, and then a board wipe on top. This card has won me so many games when I think I'm out of it, that I think it definitely deserves a slot in your Omnath deck. I also play Chroma's Memorial. This is again gold border because it's not listed as something you should play with Omnath. I think generally what's happening here is people are trying to find finishers which are very much in the flavour of Omnath, very much landfall matters stuff, and that's the way that the deck suggestions are going. But Chroma's Memorial is just a premium finisher. I don't think there's any reason you shouldn't play it in a deck which is going to be generating big powerful creatures. The Chroma's Memorial comes down and creatures you control get flying, first strike, vigilance, trample, haste and protection from black and red. That's something that a lot of players don't see coming, and you can really win games out of nowhere with that card. And the final finisher I want to talk about is Grafted Exoskeleton. So again, this has a gold border. It's not listed online as something you should be playing in Omnath, but I wholeheartedly disagree. Grafted Exoskeleton is an equipment artifact for 4 mana, and you can equip it for 2. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has Infect. And when Grafted Exoskeleton becomes unattached from a permanent, sacrifice that permanent. So there is a slight downside here in that if somebody has artifact removal but not creature removal, once you've attached it to Omnath, they can remove the Grafted Exoskeleton and Omnath would die. But I think the upside is definitely worth it. Giving Omnath Infect, meaning you only have to do 10 damage through his second ability to kill your opponents. People don't see that coming. Especially if you're playing a lot of life gain decks, it doesn't matter how much life your opponents have gained, if they're well out of range of your traditional damage game strategy, Grafted Exoskeleton can really come in clutch. So now we're going to talk about some of the lands that we run in this deck. We run the full set of premium fetch lands in Arid Mesa, Windswept Heath, Bloodstained Mire, Misty Rainforest, Verdant Catacombs, Scalding Tarn and Wooded Foothills. These cards just do so much work as a land because they get you 2 land drops off of each card. So we also play some double-faced land cards. Sunmad Treachery is our first one. It costs 3 red for a sorcery where we can gain control of target creature at the end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste. This effectively, I know 5 mana is expensive for this effect, so we'd only really use it in a pinch. We also play Disciple of Freyles, which costs 3 green for a 3/3 elf druid. When Disciple of Freyles enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is that creature's power. It's brilliant to be on the back of a land that we want to play anyway. Generally, I would suggest that we don't want to play too many tap lands. Tap lands really can slow you down, but I think with these double-faced cards, if the spell side is worth it, we can afford to have a few. We also play Balaged Recovery, costs 2 and a green for a sorcery, return target card from your graveyard to your hand, and on the reverse side it is a tapped forest when it comes in. Being able to get threats back from your graveyard once your opponents have dealt with them and reland them is how this deck really does win. The last double-faced card we are playing is Valakut Awakening, so for 2 and a red it's an instant and you can put any number of cards from your hand on the bottom of your library, then draw that many cards +1. There's a worst case on this side. If we just discard Valakut Awakening, it just replaces itself. We don't have to discard our entire hand, so we can selectively keep the best cards that we've got and chuck away any that are not particularly relevant to the board state, things that we need at the moment, and hopefully draw something better. This reverse side as a worst case scenario is a tapped mountain. I also recommend playing Highland Forest, Cinderglade and Stomping Ground. So these are particularly important because they have the land type mountain and forest, so there are quite a lot of our ramp spells and also our fetch lands which can find specifically mountains or forests. So these 3 cards allow us to fix our lands early on to make sure that we've got access to all the colours that we need. Something I found with playing these 3 cards is that when you are searching for a forest, for example, you might not want to automatically go for a Stomping Ground or a Cinderglade. If you don't have anything to do with that untapped mana that turn, especially early on in the game, Finding a Highland Forest, having it come in tapped, can be even better for you because it allows Cinderglade and Stomping Ground to be left in your deck for a later search when actually that untap ability might be more relevant, or you might just natural them and be able to lay them untapped from your hand. I also play Mosswalk Bridge, so this is a hideaway land. It taps for green and it comes in tapped, but when it enters the battlefield you can look at the top 4 cards of your library and exile one of them face down, and then put the rest of them on the bottom in a random order. And then later on in the game, if you control creatures with total power 10 or greater, you can pay a green and tap Mosswalk Bridge to cast a card for free. This card can win you so many games, paired with something like a Crowa's Memorial. I also play Kessig Wolf Run in this deck. This is the land that taps for colourless, but its ability of pay X, red, green, and tap it to give target creature +X, +0, and trample until end of turn is really what it's in here for. It's a little bit of a finisher if you need to get that extra trample damage over. Shifting Woodland is a land that comes in tapped unless you control a forest. Generally, we are going to be controlling a forest, so I would say 90% of the time this is just coming in and tapping for green. But it also has Delirium for 2 green, and Shifting Woodland becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn. But you can only activate this if you have 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. The final kind of non-basic land that we play is Witch's Clinic. So this is another land that taps for colourless, but it can also pay 2, tap it, and target commander gains lifelink until end of turn. So this is brilliant if we are abusing Omnath's second ability. Giving him lifelink can really kind of help our life total, especially if we're playing other decks which might be quite aggressive and hammering our life total early on. So to complete the deck, we also play 11 basic forests and 8 basic mountains. So now I want to talk about a couple of traps that I've seen. So these are recommendations that I've seen online or in other deck tech videos of cards or strategies that I don't think are where you want to be if you want to be building one of the most powerful Omnath builds that you can. So the first kind of strategy is additional land drops, things like Oracle of Moldiah, Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Azusa Lost but Seeking, Exploration and Burgeoning. These cards allow you to play additional lands on top of the one that you would get as a game action per turn. I don't think these cards are necessarily bad, but I do think if you are playing this strategy that you need to really lean into it. I've seen decks that have 1 or 2 of these cards in there, not really much support for it. I think if you want to play this strategy, you have to fully lean into it and you have to play all of the cards that allow you to play additional lands, with the exception of Burgeoning, because that's only from your hand, and I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. The other issue that I found with these cards is that you often run out of lands in your hand to be able to lay. So unless you've got another way to find lands, play them from somewhere else, then you very often end up with a card which is not really doing much later on in the game. If you are leaning into this strategy, I think the way you want to do it is you want to be able to replay lands that sacrifice themselves from your graveyard. I think that's the way you can ramp and the way you can get the most value out of this. In order to do that, you have to be playing all of the cards within this kind of strategy of extra land drops. On top of that, you need to be able to play lands back out from your graveyard. Particularly, we'll be looking at things like Wooded Foothills, which allow us to play it, sacrifice it, search for a forest or mountain card, and then we can relay that. So we can relay the same fetch land 2, 3, 4 times a turn if we have a few of these cards out. To get lands back from our graveyard, I think you should be running Conduit of Worlds, Crucible of Worlds, and Ruminap Excavator. Again, you need to be running all of these. This is quite a fragile strategy. The reason that I haven't put this as my deck list for this video is for that reason. I think it is a bit of a glass cannon strategy. I think it probably is the most powerful thing you can be doing in a landfall matters deck, but there are a lot of pieces and a lot of hoops you've got to jump through to get there. So I do have a deck list for this in the description below as well, if this is the way you wanted to take your deck. On top of the extra land drops and being able to play lands out from our graveyard, I think you'd also need to ensure that you have some kind of sacrifice fetch land to be able to abuse in that scenario. So I think you should also be running Crop Rotation, Sylvan Scrying, and things like Elvish Reclaimer to make sure that you have all the pieces you need to make this function. The second trap cards that I want to talk about are Where Ancients Tread and Warstorm Surge. Where Ancients Tread costs 4 and a red for an enchantment which reads, when a creature with power 5 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may have Where Ancients Tread deals 5 damage to target creature or player. And Warstorm Surge costs 5 and a red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, it deals damage equal to its power to any target. So Where Ancients Tread is a bit cheaper in terms of mana cost, but you have to have creatures that have power 5 or greater. Warstorm Surge is not so picky, but it does cost 6 mana to bring in. I personally think these cards are traps in higher power games because I just don't simply think they do enough. Paying 6 mana for an enchantment which doesn't do anything when it comes in. If you have a creature which already produces additional creatures when you lay a land, I think this is just more of a win more card. I've found that when I've played these cards, they've been stuck in my hand. I haven't got a way to activate them. I'd much rather see something like a removal spell, card draw, or additional lands, additional ramp spells really, than one of these. So I think in the higher power games where every turn really matters, I don't think you can take a turn off to lay these cards. I think in mid-power decks and kind of more battlecruiser Magic, I think these are perfectly good options. I think these are actually really good options. They're great. They are really powerful, but I just think they take a bit more setup, and they take too much setup for the speed that you're going to encounter in high power Commander. That brings us to the end of the video. You can find links to the main deck that we've gone over in detail in today's video. You can also find a deck list for the land recursion theme that I touched on in the trap section, and also a budget version if that's more what you're looking for. I'm PowerEight, and thank you for watching. This is my first video, so please like it if you want more, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one.